Welcome to the Centre for Brexit Studies YouTube channel. Today we're joined by Senior Fellow Dr. Stephen McCabe. So we had the Queen's speech this morning. What was said about Brexit, Steve?
Well, not a great deal, because of course the government narrative at the moment is that Brexit is going to be done by the 31st of January, and indeed there is a report in this morning's HuffPost online that Johnson is going to order the term Brexit not to be used by government officials after the 31st of January to give this impression that it's done and dusted. Of course, anybody who knows anything about this knows that that's far from the truth, and the really hard aspect of so-called Brexit, the negotiation of the trade agreement with the EU, takes place for the remainder of the sort of transition period up to this time next year, or the 31st of December in 2020. But this is about giving the impression that Johnson has delivered what he promised, which is to get Brexit done by the 31st. So it's that. But of course, the sort of Queen's speech is very much about doing the sort of things that he promised, certainly in the sort of the manifesto, which of course was pretty light to say the least, certainly in comparison to the Labour Party's huge tone. But this is about sort of looking forward and all the sort of the wonderful things that we can expect in the sort of the years from here on in.
So it's been a week since the general election. What has been your standout moment since then?
Well, quite clearly we're in a Conservative administration that was somewhat unexpected. To have ended up with a sort of 80-seat majority is beyond most people's expectations, I suspect, even within the Tory party. So they are utterly dominant in a way that's not been the case for a generation, certainly since the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. And we will see what that brings us. But of course, what we've also got is a Conservative administration which is shorn of any opposition. The likes of the Dominic Greaves, who stuck with the party, well, till he became an independent, shall we say, Anna Soubry and others who went to the Liberal Democrats, and they're all gone. So he has MPs who are going to be compliant in every way possible. They're also very young. Some of them, of course, will be very inexperienced because they fought in seats that they didn't expect to win. On the other sort of side of the coin, we've got no opposition to speak of. I mean, the Labour Party is in a pretty poor position and without effective leadership, so it's going through its own sort of kind of civil war, although they're just about managing to hold off on that, so that'll trundle on for the next number of months. And also, of course, the sort of Liberal Democrat Party, and let's not forget it was Jo Swinson who called this election in the expectation that she was going to do well out of it, and indeed ended up losing her own seat, and is ended up with one less MP than in the last election in 2017. So it's a very different Parliament, different Speaker, of course. So yeah, it's kind of an epoch moment, and we shall see what happens in terms of the legislation that comes forward. But I mean, quite clearly, Brexit will dominate it for the sort of foreseeable future in terms of the next 12 months, whatever else they may say. But beyond that, then the other parties have to start rebuilding. Of course, there's only one other party that did well was the SNP, unsurprisingly. So I suppose we'll hear that question being raised and being kicked back at the Scottish independence. So interesting times.
So who are you expecting to be the next leader of the Labour Party?
Oh gosh, that's interesting. From a personal perspective, I think it has to sort of be a move away from Corbynism, which has clearly been seen to have been deficient in every way, shape and form. So in that sense, that rules out the likes of Rebecca Long-Bailey, possibly even Angela Rayner. My personal preference would be someone like Keir Starmer, maybe Yvette Cooper, who stood last time. I mean, that would show a sort of a shift away from Corbynism and to some extent back to the centre. Emily Thornberry, maybe. It's very difficult. I mean, quite clearly that there's a whole question about it should be a woman. By and large, I mean, the chances are it will be. But it has to be somebody who wants to, if you like, recapture the party and move it back to the centre ground, which to some extent, strange enough, you've got a very right-wing Conservative party, but of course the sort of the agenda that's been put forward has a lot of resonance with sort of Blair in the sort of the late 1990s. But yeah, it's going to be difficult. They've got a tough job, and of course the other thing about sort of the Labour Party is the membership will have a very large say in it, And of course, there are still a lot of the so-called Corbynites, particularly Momentum, who exist, and they're not going to go anywhere in the very near future.
So looking back at the year then, what have been the moments that probably shocked and surprised you the most from Parliament?
Well, the fact, I suppose, that sort of people watch parliamentary TV and watched it for its entertainment value and learnt an awful lot about parliamentary procedure. We're all a lot more clued up about Erskine Erskine May. Sorry, my mistake. Erskine Childers was a diplomat. Erskine May than would have been the case probably 12 months ago. We learnt an awful lot about the power of the Speaker through John Burker, who has become a celebrity in his own right. Politics became interesting, but the other aspect of that was that people became disillusioned with it. They felt that parliamentarians were somehow not working their interests. I beg to differ. I think that they were trying to get a reasonable compromise. As it's turned out, we'll probably end up with a very hard Brexit as a consequence of everything that's gone on. And again, in terms of standout moments, it has been a fascinating period, and I'm sure in decades, maybe in centuries to come, but certainly in the years to come, there will be tomes written about this tumultuous period. It's also a period, and certainly since the referendum, where politics became very much more bitter, and let's hope maybe that we'll return to some sort of sanity where politics becomes a little less emotional. And that's the thing about the whole aspect of leaving the EU. It's divided political loyalties, even families, in a way which people would never have imagined 5 years ago.
And what are your highlights include from the past year in politics? Any good moments?
Well, I personally believe that the fact that parliamentarians were able to demonstrate that Parliament does have sovereignty in the way that, let's face it, Theresa May, she didn't want to go to Parliament with her deal because she recognised there would be difficulties. So the fact that, and of course that took a High Court judgment through Gina Miller to achieve. And these, I think, are good things. The fact that the Supreme Court, they trimmed the wings of Boris Johnson, who's illegally prorogued Parliament. The reality is it's not made one heap of the difference. But hey, I still think that contrary to what a lot of people tend to think, driven by the more manic aspects of the press, parliamentarians are very hard-working people, and I choose to believe that they work in the national interest as much as possible and get much maligned for it. So it's difficult. But again, the highlight is that there are lots of really decent people. And in fact, and again, it's both a highlight and a downside. These very decent people who worked hard to secure an outcome which they believed would be in the national interest. That's really good. It's very sad that many of those hard-working, decent people are no longer in Parliament. Maybe we may see their return, but I suspect not anytime soon.
So what are you expecting from the first few months of 2020?
Well, the first month will be dominated by getting Brexit through. The withdrawal bill may be agreed tomorrow. I think that's the intention, to have that done this side of Christmas. But obviously there'll be a certain amount of tidying up on that. Beyond that, as is being indicated by reports, the government, Johnson and his advisors, would like to pretend that after 31st of January, it's all over. Well, of course, we know it's not. There's going to be an awful lot of pretty difficult negotiations in terms of the free trade agreement, and possibly a crisis coming up to the 31st December, if that's not been concluded. So no deal is not off the agenda, and certainly the EU have said that they're not going to allow another extension. But hey, everyone said lots of things wouldn't happen, and they have done. But beyond that, though, I suppose maybe we'll get back to the more normal bread and butter issues. But then, this election has raised the fact that there are an awful lot of disgruntled people, and whether they will see any radical improvement in their prospects is hard to see. Certainly not in 12 months. But sanity to some extent will return
Thanks for joining us, Steve.
You're welcome.